Professor Christopher Bae, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup, all the way from your office in Mānoa, Hawaii. You are Professor of Anthropology, former chair of the Department of Anthropology, and current director of the Center of Korean Studies, University of Hawaii, and your main interest center around the human evolutionary record in East Asia and all its intriguing species, especially those discovered in recent years. Welcome to the show, Chris. You've just returned from attending conferences in China about this research. So how did it go?
All right. Thank you very much, Mark, for the invitation to come speak to you this morning. It's, I think, evening in your time. But yes, I just returned. I just returned from China, participating in two conferences related to paleoanthropology. The first conference was in Beijing and was organized by the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And that conference was, the theme there was to celebrate the 95th anniversary of the discovery of the first Homo erectus skull at Jukutian, Locality 1. And so I presented a paper there and participated in other activities as well. And then the second conference that I attended was a site called Hualongdong, which is in Anhui province in central China. And that was really celebrating the opening of a new museum and exhibit at the site. The site's been known since the early 2000s, but over the course of the past 10 years, researchers from the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology have been doing extensive field and lab work at the site. And so for the past 10 years, and so they wanted to have a celebratory conference there as well. So I participated and presented some information there. And also, the paper that I presented at the Jukutian conference in Beijing was intended to be provocative. And, what it was is that, the title of the paper is called Models in Paleolithic Archaeology, but you could also say paleoanthropology as well. But, Asian paleoanthropologists, Paleolithic archaeologists, they have received a lot of training from Western paleoanthropologists, Western scientists, and they've tended to bring those traditions to places like China. And something that I've worked on a long time with various colleagues in the field is looking at the question of the Middle Paleolithic, the quote-unquote Middle Paleolithic, because in China, there's no clear evidence of the Middle Paleolithic based on the Chinese record, but Chinese have a tendency to, not all Chinese, but some Chinese have a tendency to just call this or that Middle Paleolithic without really knowing why they're calling it, other than because the European Paleolithic record is a three-stage where you've got a lower Paleolithic, a Middle Paleolithic, and then an upper Paleolithic. But in the West, the Middle Paleolithic is usually defined by the presence of what's referred to as a Levallois technology, stone tool technology, right? But it's not clear in China. And so my colleagues and I, put together a series of papers over the years, and we said, you know what, maybe for now we should actually just have a two-stage Paleolithic sequence, because there's no clear Levallois technology that would, clearly define Middle Paleolithic in East Asia. So that was the purpose of that talk there, and that was actually very well received, saying that a lot of the researchers said, you know what, maybe it's time to start using or developing models, in Asia that are based on Asian data, as opposed to using models, from the West and trying to fit in the Asian data, which don't always fit, because Asia is quite different from Europe. And so I think that there tended to be a lot of support for that discussion. But it was important to remind everybody that Asia needs to be able to stand on its own now with its own record. They've been doing paleoanthropological research in Asia for more than 100 years now. So there's a very extensive record out there. So and then the other presentation that I gave in Hualongdong is something that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but that was about Homo juluensis and really introducing Homo juluensis to the broader community there. So that I think was also fairly well received as well, because a lot of people really agree with the groupings that we had in the Nature Communications paper that just came out.
Before we dive into the complex and ever-evolving world of East Asian paleoanthropology, let's just hear a little bit about your early days. Chris, what interests and encounters did you have growing up that led you to the work that you're doing today?
You know, Mark, that's actually a really good question. I think I have a bit of an unusual, atypical background and upbringing. I was born in Korea, but at around the age of 1, I was abandoned by my parents, and then I lived in an orphanage in Korea. But at the age of around 1.5, I was adopted by Caucasian American family, and I ended up coming to America, at that time, and I grew up in New York, Long Island. And so, growing up in an all-white, neighborhood and family, it really made, human variation distinct, right? You take a family photo, and you're the one that's standing out, right, as being looking different. So, when I got to college, I ended up going to Stony Brook, which happened to be the university very close to where I grew up. It turned out to be a really good choice because the anthropology department was and is still top notch. But when I went to Stony Brook, I became really interested in my Korean ancestry and roots at that time. And so I had the opportunity to go to Korea on an exchange program. And there, what happened is that I was introduced to a Korean Paleolithic archaeologist who got his PhD from UC Berkeley. And so he was well versed with, American culture and everything. And so he took me under his wing. And so he started to allow me to do field work when I was an undergraduate student out in sites in Korea. So that's really how I started getting even more interested in Korean paleoanthropology, and more generally Eastern Asian paleoanthropology. But paleoanthropology itself, if you think about it, the definition of paleoanthropology is trying to reconstruct, what happened without having a full record. So trying to kind of put together a puzzle without all the pieces. And I really see it as part of my own story as well, because I've always been interested in trying to find my own roots, right? I've tried to find my biological parents, and so I think when I realized, when I was always interested in that part of my life, and then I realized what paleoanthropology was about, it kind of segued and really made sense for me, and it's really what drew me to the field. So. After graduate school at Rutgers, what happened is after that is I went to the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. From this point forward, I will just abbreviate it as the IVPP. So I went to the IVPP on a postdoc research fellowship, and so I was there for 2 years. And then after that, I moved, and then eventually I came to the University of Hawaii at Mānoa in 2008, and where I've been ever since. So it's a bit of a roundabout way of coming about, but being based in Hawaii is actually a good thing if you're working in Asia, because it's relatively close. So I think everything worked out for a reason.
Well, when people think of the study of human origins, they tend to think of Africa. Africa is where some of the most famous finds have been discovered: Lucy, Ardi, Homo naledi, and so on. But for quite a while, Asia was the focus of paleoanthropology. Chris, can you outline for us the history of human origins research in Asia?
Sure, Mark. I can. It would probably take about 2 or 3 hours, but I want to introduce you guys to this, which is actually my new book. It just came out earlier this year. In the first chapter of this book, it talks about the history of paleoanthropological research in Asia. And many people who are just entering the field now may not realize, but East Asia and Southeast Asia used to be considered to be more important for paleoanthropology and human origins than Africa. And a good example is the famous zoologist from the 1800s, Ernst Haeckel. He suggested that if we're going to look for the quote unquote missing link, it's probably going to between man and ape. It's probably going to be someplace in Southeast Asia, and part of the reason for this is that he argued that we are more closely related. Keep in mind, this is the 1800s in the time period, so we are more closely related to gibbons. And people will probably think, how in the world could people think that we are more closely related to gibbons? But gibbons are generally monogamous, and they, when they are on the ground, they actually walk bipedally, right? And so zoologists said, oh, they're definitely more like us because we're monogamous and we walk bipedally. So it seemed to kind of make sense. Haeckel also suggested that if you're going to look for the missing link, it would probably be in this continent called Lemuria. And this continent apparently is in the Indian Ocean, but it sank. So this is all hypothetical, and Haeckel didn't really have any evidence for it, and so I don't think it was widely believed. But what happened is that Eugene Dubois, a medical doctor and anatomy professor, decided in the late 1800s, you know what? I think Haeckel is right, and I think that if we move to Southeast Asia, we might actually be able to find the missing link. And so he got his whole family. He got a position in the army, and he moved his whole family to Indonesia. He started working, at a site called Trinil, and then he discovered what eventually became known as Homo erectus. This is in the early 1890s. But initially, these finds weren't accepted by the wider scientific community. So that was kind of put on the side, by Dubois. But we now, talk about Eugene Dubois' research and these Homo erectus fossils from Indonesia, quite commonly now in all these discussions about early hominids from the region. So, but the other area though that people probably are not as aware of is something called the Central Asiatic Expeditions, and this was Henry Fairfield Osborn was the former director of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And it's interesting because he said, you know what, if we're going to find the missing link, human origins is probably going to be someplace in Central Asia. And so, he had this hypothesis out there, but nobody really took him up on it. But then along came, Roy Chapman Andrews, who was a curator in the AMNH at the time. And he said, you know what, if you give me the money, I'll actually be able to go find the missing link in Central Asia. Or, they were really looking at Mongolia because it was a blank spot on the map at the time. And so what they ended up doing is they started to, go around and ask for donations. They applied for money, and they ended up carrying out these really large-scale expeditions out in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, and that whole region out in the desert area. You're talking about, they did this in the 1920s, and so you're talking about, them coming up with an annual budget of like $200,000. In today's money, that's a lot of money, right? But even back then, it was huge amount of money. So, actually, these mechanized vehicles, cars that they took out to the desert with them, they'd have like between 10 and 20 cars. They'd have hundreds of camels. It was a major expedition that they went out, and it was amazing because at the time Mongolia was largely unpoliced, right? So it was really a lot of banditry going on. And so everybody, and even Roy Chapman Andrews, everybody had to carry around guns with them and protect themselves from the banditry that went on. When the soldiers were not getting paid, they themselves became bandits. So they would have armed militia protecting them and stuff. And so the rumor has it that Roy Chapman Andrews was actually the model for the Indiana Jones character. And you look at the original pictures of Roy Chapman Andrews. He's got the hat, he's got the gun, he's got everything, everything except the whip. So I guess they added the whip as an afterthought to make Indiana Jones more cooler looking, right? So, but part of the reason why we don't really talk about the Central Asiatic expeditions in terms of paleoanthropology is they didn't really find anything that was related to early human origins. But the reason why we still talk about these expeditions is one of the biggest finds that they made out there is they found dinosaur eggs. So in the 1920s, nobody really knew how dinosaurs, reproduced. And for them to actually have discovered dinosaur eggs kind of made sense in terms of like what we know now. But it was really the first step in terms of, wow, the dinosaurs actually laid eggs, right? And so it was actually really significant news at the time. And it changed, how paleontologists viewed dinosaurs and dinosaur evolution. And then also in the 1920s, if you move to China and you move to a site called Jukutian Locality 1, they started to find Homo erectus fossils at this site. And they found upwards of between 40 and 50 individuals of Homo erectus at the site. The site itself actually has 26 different localities. So another major site is called Jukutian Upper Cave or Shandidno. Where they found human burials from the late Pleistocene. And so this is a major site that was related to human evolution because it's the biggest site, in Eastern Asia for Homo erectus finds. We may talk about it in a later interview, but the Peking man fossils in 1920s and 1930s were not safe because of the eventual entrance of the United States into World War II, right? So what they realized, the researchers in Beijing, what they realized is that they probably need to ship these fossils someplace else at least outside of Beijing for safekeeping. And so the conclusion that they drew was that they would send these the original Jukutian fossils, they would send them to the American Museum of Natural History in New York for the duration of the war. And so they were packed into some crates and then shipped, put on a train, and sent to Tianjin, the port city. The only problem is that they never arrived. And so to this day, we have no idea where the original fossils are. I always tell my students that if they want a dissertation project that would be really interesting and cool, is to really do further investigation and try to find where these fossils are. But that's 1920s, 1930s, and then after that, they started to make some really significant finds. After the Tong Child in Africa, finding like robust australopiths, paranthropus, fossils, and in East Africa and South Africa. And so really the field's emphasis really changed, moved from Asia to Africa as a result of that.
Chris, how does this myriad of Asian fossils fit into the so-called muddle-in-the-middle debate?
That's a good question, Mark. Something that my colleagues and I have been working on a lot for the past several years. But probably what we want to do is first talk about what actually is the muddle-in-the-middle, and really. What's happened is we're talking about the Middle Pleistocene time period, so between about 780,000 years ago up to about 127,000 years ago. And fossils that have normally not been assigned or could not be assigned easily to Homo erectus or Homo neanderthalensis or Homo sapiens would be grouped into this muddle here. And so they'd be grouped into a taxon. It's not actually a taxon, but it's just a group called archaic Homo sapiens. Some people call these guys mid-Pleistocene Homo or Middle Pleistocene Homo, and they get this very generic name without really having any meaning to it. And so paleoanthropologists starting in the 1980s said, you know what? There's no other biological organism out there that has the name archaic attached to it except Homo sapiens. So it doesn't really make any sense, right? So we should probably assign this group a name. And so the name Homo heidelbergensis, came about. It was basically resurrected. It was originally based off of the Mauer mandible way back in like 1907. But so Homo heidelbergensis started to take hold, and paleoanthropologists were starting to assign a lot of the European fossils and a lot of the African fossils to heidelbergensis, and they even started to assign the Chinese fossils to heidelbergensis as well. So a few colleagues and I got together and we started looking at this question. Mirjana Roksandich, Pejoratovich, Shujie Wu, and myself, we started to really look at this heidelbergensis question, and we drew the conclusion that Homo heidelbergensis is nothing more than a garbage can taxon as well. It's simply replacing archaic Homo sapiens, but everything that was originally placed in archaic Homo sapiens is now simply placed into Homo heidelbergensis. So it doesn't really help us clarify the record at all. And so what we suggested is, you know what? Let's come up with something new and creative. And so we came up with the name Homo bodoensis, and where we assigned Eastern European fossils, the Levantine fossils, and then the African fossils to bodoensis, and then Western Europe fossils would be assigned as early Neanderthals there. And so that was just a matter of trying to clear up the record. The immediate response, because one of the things that we argued in our paper is that since Homo heidelbergensis is a garbage can taxon, we need to probably get rid of it, stop using it, and then we'll replace it with Homo bodoensis. Now, based on the rules of priority, if you get rid of Homo heidelbergensis, you have to use the name that's next up on the list, right? That was proposed, and the next name up on the list is Homo rhodesiensis, based off of the Kabwe fossil. So rhodesiensis was actually named. It's a toponym named after the area called Rhodesia, and Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes. Who was a colonialist miner, late 1800s, early 1900s, and he caused a lot of destruction and a lot of problems, for the people living in that region. And in this day and age of decolonizing our field, it's probably, we said, you know what, it's not appropriate for us to, start using the name Rhodesiensis, and especially if it turns out to be the earliest ancestor of modern humans, right? After somebody who's an open racist. So we said, we need to get rid of the name Rhodesiensis as well. And so that's the reason why we came up with the name Homo bodoensis. So the immediate pushback from that is that, people said heidelbergensis, okay, it's a problem, and maybe just the molar mandible, should fit, within heidelbergensis. And right now there seems to be a consensus that the name itself, heidelbergensis, is not a problem. The molar mandible fits it. Right now, it's not openly accepted that a lot of other fossils should be assigned to heidelbergensis. But we ended up going down a rabbit hole regarding Rhodesiensis because we proposed to remove the name entirely based on ethical concerns. Naming, having a name after some, basically an open racist colonialist. And so we started to have interaction then with the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature, the ICZN, because they set the rules for how we can add or remove names to the biological record. And they said you can't remove names based off of ethical concerns. And so we said, actually, I think in this case we probably can. And so it became a real big debate that we've been involved with in the past couple of years as a result of this. But if you think about the biological sciences more broadly, you look at ornithology and most recently botany. These fields, their associations decided to vote on it, and they voted and accepted that they're going to change the names of they're going to remove egregious names from their biological organisms in their fields. So it's only a matter of time before anthropology follows suit and start removing names of egregious people that were really, really bad people during their lifetimes. And if you look at them now in today's lens, they probably look even worse, right? So probably Rhodesiensis is going to get removed at some point.
Your paper, Making Sense of Eastern Asian Late Quaternary Hominin Variability, was released just recently, November 2024. In it, you discuss the current hominin fossil record of Eastern Asia, including the fascinating species we've come to know in recent years, such as the Denisovans and the so-called hobbit Homo floresiensis. So, how has the paper been received, and what do you hope it will achieve?
That's a good question. When we were putting the paper together, we immediately we knew from the get-go that this was going to be a very provocative paper, and the intent of the paper is to get people really to think about the different issues and stuff. And um, if we take a step back just to talk a little bit about how we got interested in this topic to begin with, it's interesting because uh, when we started working on the question about Middle Pleistocene hominid fossils in China, we realized that some Western paleoanthropologists were saying that we should just group all the Chinese fossils into Homo heidelbergensis, just adding even more to the garbage can taxon. And so we said, no, it doesn't look like that. And so over the past several years, we've been studying some fossils like Shujiayao and Xuchang, and we realized that there's actually a lot more variability in Asia than what has been recently thought, or traditionally considered as well, right? And so we had a meeting of the minds back in the summer of 2023. We had a meeting in the IVPP to talk about this variability, and we decided that there were actually at least three different groups of fossils, that populations that could be that are present in China. One that is revolves around Homo longi, and then another that's a combination of Maba and Hathnora Narmada in India. And then this other group that have all these fossils in it that included Shujiayao, Xuchang, Shahe, Penghe, the new fossil from Cobra Cave in Laos could also be included in this group, and then the Denisova fossils as well. And so when we followed up with this, Shujia Wu and I decided, we've been working on this, and we said Shujia Yao and Xuchang, clearly in every analysis that we did, they always group together and they group away from Homo longi. And so we said that there's enough evidence to produce or at least propose a new species, and we called it Homo juluensis. Juluensis, the name comes from literally having a big head. So it's interesting when you want to name a species. We're not naming it after a toponym. We're not naming it after an eponym. Naming it after a person. We're just naming it based on the fact that it has a really really large head. So which is kind of funny if you think about it. I mentioned this to my students. They all started laughing. So but one of the things, and I think most people will eventually, we said, what, let's propose this. We'll put it out there, and people will either recognize it or they won't recognize it. And I think most people will eventually get on board to recognize it. Shujiayao and Xuchang, Shujiayao being the holotype or the type specimen, and then Xuchang being very very closely related morphologically to Shujiayao, so it'd be considered what's referred to as the paratype, or something that's very, very close to the original. And then within the family itself, the so-called hypodyme, based on really dentognathic, so basically more similarities in the teeth and the mandible, we argue that we can easily group the Shahe, Penghe, the Laos Cobra Cave fossils, and really importantly, the Denisova fossils into the Homo juluensis hypodyme. And when we were putting the paper together, we said, what, people will probably agree with Shujiayao and Xuchang, but to actually assign the Denisova fossils to Homo juluensis is going to be a bit provocative, right? But when you look at the fossils, the teeth from Denisova, and you look at like the second molar from Denisova, and you look at the second molar from Shujiayao, they look almost identical. I mean, they're large. They have a lot of crenulations. It's very very interesting how complex the molars are. So you cannot really, it would be very difficult to distinguish. You could, if you do enough analyses and you parse the data enough, you can find differences if that's your goal, right? But most people, when they look at the tooth occlusal surfaces, they'll say, you know what, these teeth really look a lot alike. And then, you look at the teeth from sites like Shujayao and then other sites like Xiahe and Cobra Cave. The morphologies of those molars as well are very, very similar. So it all seemed to make sense to be able to group all these fossils into the same hypodyme and then call them part of Homo juluensis. So it becomes provocative because then the argument would be that instead of calling all of these fossils Denisovans, and for the record, Denisova is not a species name. It's a name of population. It's never been proposed as a species name or accepted as a species name. So, to now have to call all these fossils, juluensis or julurans, as we call it, say in our paper, we figured that would be provocative, but the intent of the paper is really to get people to start thinking about these issues and really to acknowledge the amount of variability that's present in the hominid fossil record in Eastern Asia. And one of the things that we talked about in the paper is you combine, over the course of the past 20 years, you combine what's gone on in Europe and you combine what's gone on in Africa. There's only one new species, Homo naledi in southern Africa, right? But in Asia, you've got now 4 that are proposed, right? Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, and then you've got Homo longi, and then you have Homo juluensis now. So there's a lot more variability than people have been able to really understand, and I think that's going to be one of the major takeaway points from the paper. Yeah, and before I forget, it's important to mention Homo longi, which is the newest identified species, proposed species in China. As part of a workshop that we had in Serbia, in Novi Sad, Serbia, in the spring of 2023, we discussed Homo longi, and we all agreed that it's a valid species. It's a good fossil. The question is whether we want to include other fossils, what other fossils we want to include in there. And as a follow-up to that, we had a meeting in Beijing in the summer of 2023. And in that meeting, we talked about the variability, and we included in the resulting paper, we included the Dali fossil, and then we included Jinyushan in the hypodyme with Harbin, so into Homo longi. In the innovation paper that resulted from the summer of 2023 meeting, we actually also included Hualongdong, but in the recent Nature Communications paper, we removed it for now and left it out because we need to do further analyses. The other question that has come up here and there is whether the Denisovan should be included in Homo longi. Depending on the type of analysis you do, it's you can make a case that Denisova and even Shujayao or Shuchang can be included in the Homo longi hypodyme. But one thing that's fairly certain is that there's no connecting fossils between the Denisovan fossils and then the Harbin skull. So it's very difficult to make the case that the Denisovan fossils should be assigned to Homo longi, the Homo longi hypodyme. So for now, I think that a growing number of people will probably agree that the Denisovan fossils should be included with Shuchang and Shujayao and the other fossils that were included in Homo juluensis.
Well, it's safe to say that the complexities of Asians' hominin lineages won't be solved anytime soon, but we all look forward to the new developments that are to come. So what's next for you, Chris? What are you working on at the moment?
I'm actually working on a lot of different projects. I don't know whether I'm coming or going. And one of the things is I started out in Korea and then I expanded into Japan, and then I'm more active right now in China. I started setting up projects in Southeast Asia as well. I've been to Vietnam. National Geographic a number of years ago gave me a grant to visit and set up a new paleoanthropological project in Myanmar, which everybody was excited about because we went to Myanmar and there's no infrastructure there for this type of research. The problem then is we ran into COVID, and then as many of you know, there was the military coup in Myanmar, and so everything ended up grounding to a halt. So not sure when that'll restart, but it seems to be open as soon as things do settle down there. I have an open invitation to do set up a new project, paleo project in Thailand. It's just a matter of really, getting everything together and putting the right pieces into place. So there's a lot more coming out of Asia, and it's not just research that I'm involved with, but I am involved with a lot of different things, and I get invited to review a lot of different things as well. So I get to see a lot of different areas where there's so much coming out right now in Eastern Asia. It's pretty amazing. It's a good time to be really riding the crest into the field.
And hopefully, Chris, will have you back on the show one day, perhaps in the new year, to talk about Peking Man. How about that?
Oh yeah, I'd be delighted to come back and talk about Peking Man. There are so many different stories about where Peking Man may have actually ended up. The Peking Man fossils may have ended up, and so it would be really interesting to talk more in more detail about that.
Christopher Bae, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark, for having me on. I really enjoyed it.